The Queen of Soul, a voice that made nations tremble, died quietly, surrounded by her family. But she never found the respect she sang for. August 16, 2018. The news breaks across social media with the force of a gospel hymn reaching its crescendo. Aretha Louise Franklin, the Queen of Soul, has died at 76 from pancreatic cancer. Within hours, tributes pour in from presidents and paupers alike. But the woman who taught a nation to spell respect has taken her deepest secrets to the grave, leaving behind only the echoes of a voice that moved mountains and the fragments of multiple handwritten wills that would divide her family for years to come. The official cause of death was advanced neuroendocrine pancreatic cancer. But those who knew Aretha understood that she had been dying for years from something more complex. The exhaustion of carrying an entire people's hopes on her voice. The weight of being a symbol when all she wanted was to be a woman. The diva who could command any stage had spent her final years increasingly reclusive, canceling performances, retreating into the Detroit mansion where she had learned to sing before she learned to walk. But even in death, Aretha Franklin remained an enigma wrapped in contradictions. The woman who sang Think couldn't organize her own estate. The artist who demanded respect had left behind a legal mess that revealed the chaos beneath her carefully controlled public image. 3 different wills, handwritten and hidden in various locations throughout her home, each telling a different story about how she wanted to be remembered and who deserved what from the empire she had built note by note. This wasn't just the death of a singer. This was the end of an era when a single voice could speak for an entire movement, when gospel could become revolution, when a preacher's daughter from Detroit could teach the world the true meaning of soul. But the questions surrounding her life and death revealed truths about fame, faith, and the price of being the voice of your people that remain as urgent today as they were when she first stepped behind a microphone at 9 years old. To understand how someone who sang so powerfully about respect never quite found it in her own life, we must begin where all great American stories begin, in a church where a child learned that her voice could move heaven and earth, but also learned that carrying such power comes with a price that no amount of applause can ever fully pay. Picture this foundational scene. New Bethel Baptist Church, Detroit, 1951. A 9-year-old girl with enormous eyes and an otherworldly voice stands before the congregation. Her small hands pressed against her Sunday dress, her mouth opening to release a sound so pure, so filled with divine fire that grown men weep and women shout, "Hallelujah!" In that first solo, she gave them everything they wanted, but it would never be enough to protect her. This is where Aretha Franklin learned that her voice wasn't truly her own, that it belonged as much to the congregation as it did to her, that power and vulnerability were 2 sides of the same coin. The congregation doesn't just hear a child singing. They hear the voice of God speaking through human lips. They feel their own pain transformed into something beautiful. They witness a miracle in real time. When little Aretha finishes Precious Lord, the silence that follows is broken by an explosion of praise that seems to lift the roof off the building. Coins and crumpled bills rain into the collection plate, but what they're really giving isn't money. It's their acknowledgement that they've witnessed something sacred, something that belongs as much to them as it does to the girl who channeled it. But in that moment of triumph, a pattern is established that will define Aretha's entire existence. Her emotional and spiritual availability becomes a resource that others can draw from, a gift that belongs not just to her, but to everyone who needs to feel something larger than their daily struggles. The child prodigy doesn't understand it yet, but she's just learned the most dangerous lesson any performer can learn, that her worth is measured by her ability to make others feel the presence of the divine. Aretha Louise Franklin entered the world on March 25, 1942 in Memphis, Tennessee, born to Barbara Siggers Franklin and Clarence LaVaughn Franklin, two people whose relationship with faith, music, and each other would teach their daughter that love was both transcendent and treacherous. The defining moment came when Aretha was just 10 years old. Picture this scene. Barbara Franklin's funeral, 1952. Little Aretha stands beside her father's towering frame, watching as they lower the only source of unconditional love she had ever known into the ground. C.L. Franklin, the famous preacher whose voice could fill stadiums, is rendered speechless by grief. In that moment, Aretha learns the lesson that will haunt her entire life, that the people who love you can disappear without warning, and no amount of applause can fill that silence. The tragedy that followed was swift and devastating. At 12 years old, Aretha became pregnant with her first child, Clarence. 2 years later, another son, Edward. The circumstances were never fully discussed publicly, but the weight of becoming a mother while still a child herself created the emotional foundation that would later make her music so authentically painful. Every note she would sing carried the weight of growing up too fast, of carrying responsibilities that belong to adults. The recording career that began when Aretha was 18 was both an escape from the complications of her personal life and a way of fulfilling the destiny that everyone around her had recognized since childhood. John Hammond, the legendary talent scout who had discovered Billie Holiday and Bob Dylan, signed Aretha to Columbia Records in 1960, convinced that he had found the next great American voice. But the Columbia years were marked by artistic frustration and commercial disappointment. The label tried to mold Aretha into a jazz sophisticate in the tradition of Billie Holiday and Lena Horne, surrounding her with big band arrangements and standards that showcased her technical ability, but never quite captured the fire that made her special. The executives who controlled her career saw her as a black woman who should be grateful for the opportunity to record, not as an artist with her own vision of what her music should sound like. The young woman who had learned to command congregations through the sheer force of her voice found herself diminished by producers who thought they knew better than she did what her voice was capable of achieving. Song after song, album after album, Aretha delivered technically proficient performances that felt emotionally hollow. Commercial products that bore little resemblance to the transcendent music she created when left to her own devices. The marriage to Ted White in 1961 should have been a source of stability and support, but instead it became another form of performance, another stage where Aretha had to be something other than herself to satisfy someone else's expectations. White was older, more worldly, and convinced that he could manage Aretha's career better than the Columbia executives who seemed determined to waste her potential. He also had a temper and a need to control every aspect of his wife's life that would turn their relationship into a battlefield disguised as a marriage. White's management style was built on intimidation and isolation. He controlled Aretha's schedule, her finances, her social interactions, and her artistic decisions, creating a bubble around her that was supposedly protective but was actually imprisoning. The woman who sang about freedom and respect was living in a marriage that offered neither, trapped by legal contracts and social expectations that made escape seem impossible. But it was also during this period that Aretha began to develop the fierce independence and perfectionist control that would later define her career. Frustrated by producers who didn't understand her vision and a husband who treated her like a business asset rather than a person, she started taking more control of her own artistic process, learning to play piano well enough to accompany herself, beginning to write and arrange her own material, preparing for the artistic breakthrough that would eventually free her from everyone who tried to diminish her power. The move to Atlantic Records in 1966 was more than just a label change. It was a homecoming, a return to the musical roots that had been buried under layers of commercial compromise and artistic misunderstanding. Jerry Wexler and the team at Atlantic understood that Aretha's gift wasn't just technical proficiency. It was her ability to transform personal pain into universal truth. Picture this transformative moment. Fame Studios, Muscle Shoals, Alabama, January 1967. Aretha Franklin sits at the piano, her fingers finding the opening chords of what will become Respect. Her voice carrying all the weight of her failed marriage, her frustrated career, her lifelong search for something that looked like respect. The white Southern musicians around her recognize immediately that they're in the presence of greatness, that this woman can teach them things about music that they never learned in any classroom or concert hall. But here's the cruel irony that would define her entire existence. The woman recording the most powerful demand for respect in musical history was living in a marriage where she received none, trapped by her own success and the expectations that came with it. Every note she sang that day was a prayer for something she couldn't find in her own life. Cut to decades later. Aretha Franklin alone in her Detroit mansion, 1985, sitting at her piano in the living room in complete silence. The same fingers that had created Respect now rest motionless on the keys. The house around her is filled with gold records and awards, but the silence is deafening. She picks up a glass of wine with trembling hands, staring at her reflection in the dark window. The woman who could command any stage couldn't organize her own emotional estate, couldn't find in her private life the respect she had demanded so powerfully in public. The session that produced I Never Loved a Man was chaotic and ultimately abbreviated. Tensions between Ted White and the studio musicians led to confrontations that ended the recording early. But it also produced the sound that would define soul music for the next decade. Aretha's voice, no longer constrained by inappropriate arrangements or commercial calculations, soared and growled and whispered and shouted with a freedom that made everything she had recorded before sound like dress rehearsals. But it was the B-side of that single that would change everything, not just for Aretha but for American culture itself. Respect was originally recorded by Otis Redding as a straightforward demand from a man to his woman. But in Aretha's hands it became something revolutionary, a demand from African American women for the dignity that had been denied them, a civil rights anthem disguised as a love song, a piece of music that transformed 3 syllables into a rallying cry for an entire movement. The recording of Respect in February 1967 was one of those moments when art and history intersect to create something larger than either could achieve alone. Aretha took Otis Redding's song and made it her own by adding the famous RESPECT spelling sequence, by bringing in her sisters Irma and Carolyn to provide background vocals that turned the track into a conversation between black women, by investing every note with the authority of someone who had earned the right to make demands. But the song was also deeply personal, a musical confrontation with every man who had ever tried to diminish her. From the Columbia executives who thought they knew her voice better than she did to the husband who controlled her career while undermining her confidence. When Aretha demanded respect, she was speaking not just as the Queen of Soul, but as a woman who had been fighting for basic dignity her entire life. The success of Respect was immediate and overwhelming. The song reached #1 on both the R&B and pop charts, making Aretha the first woman to top both simultaneously since the charts had been integrated. More importantly, it established her as the voice of an entire generation of African American women who had been waiting for someone to articulate their demand for equal treatment with such power and conviction. But success at this level came with pressures that Aretha was unprepared to handle. Suddenly, everyone wanted something from her. Record executives wanted more hits. Civil rights leaders wanted her to sing at rallies and protests. Fans wanted her to be a symbol of black pride and female empowerment. Family members wanted financial support, and her husband wanted to maintain control of an empire that was growing beyond his ability to manage. The late 1960s were simultaneously the peak of Aretha's artistic achievement and the beginning of her personal unraveling. Hit followed hit, Chain of Fools, Think, You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman, I Say a Little Prayer, each one showcasing different aspects of her incredible range and emotional depth. She was selling millions of records, winning Grammy Awards, being hailed as the greatest singer of her generation. But behind the crown that the media had placed on her head, the woman was struggling with the same issues that had plagued her since childhood. The search for unconditional love, the weight of carrying other people's expectations, the exhaustion of being strong for everyone else when she felt weak and vulnerable inside. The voice that could move mountains couldn't seem to find the words to explain her own pain to the people who should have understood it best. The relationship with Ted White was becoming increasingly volatile, marked by public confrontations and private violence that Aretha tried desperately to hide from a media that wanted to believe in her as a symbol of strength and independence. The woman who sang about respect was living in a marriage where she received none, trapped by her own success and the expectations that came with it. The civil rights movement provided Aretha with a sense of purpose that extended beyond commercial success, a way of using her voice to serve something larger than her own career. When Martin Luther King Jr. asked her to sing at civil rights events, she felt like she was fulfilling the destiny that had been established when she first sang in her father's church. The little girl who had learned to move congregations was now moving an entire nation toward a more just understanding of itself. Picture this pivotal scene. Cobo Hall, Detroit, June 23, 1963. Aretha Franklin takes the stage during the Walk to Freedom March, her voice joining with those of 125,000 people demanding civil rights and economic justice. When she sings Precious Lord, the same song she had performed as a 9-year-old in her father's church, her voice carries not just her own pain but the collective anguish of a people who had been waiting too long for freedom. Martin Luther King Jr. sits behind her on the stage, tears streaming down his face as he recognizes that this woman's voice might be the most powerful weapon the movement possesses. But the assassination of Dr. King in April 1968 was devastating for Aretha both personally and professionally. She had lost not just a friend and mentor, but someone who had understood how to use her gift in service of something greater than entertainment. King's death marked the beginning of a period where Aretha would struggle to find meaning in her success, where the voice that had once seemed directly connected to divine purpose began to feel like just another product in the machinery of American celebrity. The divorce from Ted White in 1969 should have been a liberation, but instead it was another form of loss, another confirmation that love was temporary, and that independence came at a price she was never sure she could afford. The settlement left her financially devastated and emotionally exhausted, forced to rebuild her career and her personal life simultaneously while maintaining the public image of strength that her fans expected. The 1970s brought new artistic challenges and personal complications. Aretha's voice was changing as she aged, becoming richer and more nuanced, but also more fragile, requiring greater care and strategic management. The music industry was changing too, with younger artists bringing different sounds and sensibilities that made her seem like a relic of an earlier era, despite the fact that she was still in her 20s when the decade began. The relationship with actor Glyn Turman, whom she married in 1978, represented another attempt to find the companionship and stability that had eluded her throughout her life. Turman was gentler than Ted White, more supportive of her artistic independence, but he was also dealing with his own career pressures and family complications that made their marriage another complicated balancing act between public image and private reality. The 1980s marked a period of artistic resurrection and personal reflection for Aretha. The success of her album, Who's Zoomin' Who, proved that she could still create contemporary music that resonated with new generations of listeners. The collaboration with younger artists like Luther Vandross and the Eurythmics showed that her voice could adapt to new styles while maintaining the essential qualities that had always made her special. But it was also during this period that Aretha began to grapple more seriously with the costs of her lifetime of performance. The constant touring, the pressure to maintain vocal excellence, the weight of being a symbol rather than just a person. All of it had accumulated into a form of exhaustion that no amount of commercial success could cure. She began canceling performances more frequently, retreating into the Detroit mansion where she felt safe from the demands of a world that had taken so much from her. The fear of flying that developed during this period was both a practical problem and a metaphor for her growing reluctance to leave the security of home for the uncertainties of public performance. The woman who had once been fearless in her artistic ambitions was becoming increasingly cautious, protecting herself from disappointment by limiting her exposure to situations where she might be vulnerable or criticized. Picture this haunting scene from the 1990s. Aretha Franklin alone in her Detroit mansion, sitting at the piano in her living room, playing and singing for an audience of one. Her voice, even in this private moment, carries all the power and pain that have defined her career. But there's something different in this performance. A weariness, a sense of someone who has given so much of herself to others that she's not sure what's left for her own enjoyment. The later years of Aretha's career were marked by a complex relationship with her own legacy. On one hand, she was universally recognized as one of the greatest singers who had ever lived, constantly receiving honors and awards that acknowledged her contributions to American music and culture. On the other hand, she struggled with the feeling that she had never quite achieved the level of respect and understanding that she had demanded in her most famous song. The multiple marriages and relationships that ended in disappointment had taught her to be suspicious of others' motivations, to protect herself behind walls of protocol and professional distance that made genuine intimacy increasingly difficult. The woman who had sung so convincingly about love and heartbreak was becoming isolated by the very success that had been meant to liberate her. The health problems that began to affect her in the 2000s were both a natural result of decades of demanding performance and a reflection of the stress that came from living so much of her life in public. The cancellations became more frequent, the explanations more vague, the distance between public Aretha and private Aretha more pronounced. The performance at Barack Obama's inauguration in January 2009 was both a triumph and a farewell, a moment when Aretha's voice once again served as the soundtrack to American democracy, while also demonstrating the physical toll that a lifetime of performance had taken on her instrument. When she sang "My Country, 'Tis of Thee," her voice cracking slightly on the high notes, the nation heard both the power that had defined her career and the fragility that had always existed beneath it. Picture that final great moment. The steps of the U.S. Capitol, January 20th, 2009, as Aretha Franklin prepares to sing at the inauguration of America's first African-American president. She's wearing that magnificent gray hat with the bow that will become iconic, her fur coat protecting her from the cold that threatens her voice. When she begins to sing, her voice still carries echoes of that 9-year-old girl who first learned to move people through music. But it also carries all the weight of the decades in between, the triumphs and heartbreaks, the demands and disappointments, the constant pressure of being the voice of her people. The years that followed were marked by increasing reclusiveness and declining health, though Aretha continued to make occasional public appearances that reminded the world of what it would lose when her voice was finally silenced. The weight loss, the canceled performances, the growing frailty, All of it pointed toward an ending that she was determined to face on her own terms. The discovery of pancreatic cancer was kept private for as long as possible, another example of Aretha's lifelong need to control her own narrative, to decide when and how much of herself to share with a world that had always demanded more than she was comfortable giving. Even facing death, she was still the woman who had learned as a child that her emotional availability was a resource that others could exhaust. August 16th, 2018. In her Detroit home, surrounded by family and friends, Aretha Franklin draws her last breath, her voice finally at rest after 76 years of carrying more weight than any single instrument should be asked to bear. The woman who had taught America to spell R-E-S-P-E-C-T was gone, leaving behind a catalog of recordings that would continue to move people long after her physical presence had been silenced. The funeral at Greater Grace Temple in Detroit was everything that Aretha's life had been. A mixture of sacred and secular, public and private, celebration and mourning. The service lasted 7 hours, filled with performances by artists who had been influenced by her work and testimonies from people whose lives had been changed by her voice. It was both a fitting tribute to her legacy and a final performance in the tradition she had established as a child in her father's church. But even in death, Aretha remained an enigma. The discovery of multiple handwritten wills in her home revealed a woman who had been trying until the end to control how she would be remembered and what would happen to the empire she had built. The legal battles that followed between her sons and other family members were a final confirmation that success had not brought her the peace she had spent her lifetime seeking. The 3 wills, found in different locations throughout her house, told different stories about her intentions and priorities. One was found in a locked cabinet, another under couch cushions, a third in a spiral notebook. Each document revealed different aspects of her thinking about legacy, family, and the proper distribution of an estate worth millions of dollars. The confusion and contradictions in these documents seemed to reflect the complexity of a woman who had spent her entire life trying to balance competing demands and expectations. Aretha Franklin died because the crown she wore was too heavy for any single person to carry, and she had spent her entire life trying to be worthy of the expectations that came with being the voice of her people. She wasn't destroyed by fame or success. She was worn down by the weight of being a symbol when all she had ever wanted was to be a woman who happened to have an extraordinary voice. When the voice becomes the message, the person behind it sometimes gets lost in the translation. Aretha's story isn't just about a great singer. It's about what happens when one person is asked to carry the hopes and dreams of an entire people, when individual pain is transformed into collective healing, when the price of moving others is the exhaustion of your own emotional resources. The girl who once stood on a street corner in Caracas wasn't there, but the lesson remains the same. Authenticity is currency. Voice is power, and the terrible mathematics of fame that calculate human worth by the ability to make others feel something larger than themselves. Aretha Franklin learned early that her voice belonged as much to others as it did to her, and she spent her entire life trying to find a way to honor that responsibility while still protecting something essential for herself. The crown she wore was too heavy for one person to carry, but it was a weight the world couldn't see, until it was already too late. What hidden truths about the price of being the voice of your people might Aretha Franklin's story still reveal to those brave enough to look beyond the legend? Her life and death continue to ask the hardest questions about success, service, and the human cost of carrying other people's hopes in your voice. Questions that remain as urgent today as they were when she first learned to spell R-E-S-P-E-C-T for a world that still struggles to understand what that word truly means.